the library information system. When all of this data and information about history is supposed to be collected, archived, and documented, it has to have somewhere to live. You have to have something devoted to the preservation of that material. And one of the main sources over the course of human history has had to do with the library system. The library system is supposed to be, generally speaking, a public system so that people who need access to technology, information, educational resources, and things of that nature have an opportunity to go somewhere to obtain those materials in a shared manner in a given community. But a lot of libraries moved into a privatized system where they have the same functions as public libraries, except they're housed instead in a private setting or a more controlled setting. Colleges and universities, independent, appointment only type of systems, some corporations, organizations, and other institutions have internal libraries, medical libraries within hospitals, and what have you. Meaning that the information is available. Then the question becomes, all right, who has access to it? Because they can house information however they choose to. You're even seeing more and more local communities come up with privatized library systems or personal library systems, because you can have access to something that none of those institutions, organizations, or corporations has in terms of information. See, part of the goal to obtain these types of cultural assets in the beginning was telling everybody that, look, destroy all your paperwork. We're going to become a paperless society. We're going to become a paperless society, and you can put everything on your computer. That was one of the biggest tricks and deceptions I think that has ever happened in human history, because the computer system, the network, it was always open for people who are trying to police that type of material to have access to something that people were doing online. Anything that flows throughout the network system, somebody somewhere has some access to, even if only the people that regulate the network and the portal. And so people were willing to go out there and put all of their personal information, all of their personal data, all of their everything online for complete strangers, not knowing where it would ever end up again, because they wanted to be a part of a social network to make themselves feel included in a virtual reality versus reality. The majority of the people online who say they're friends and know one another don't really actually have any knowledge of one another. But the fact that there was something available so that if you do want to get to know somebody more personally, you could, when it was previously unavailable, made it very, very attractive and very lucrative. And advertisers and marketers started to realize what you could do with that to bring people together, to inform them, to notify them. You don't have to necessarily rely on standard system mail anymore, because you can get something to someone faster, sooner, easier, doing it online and electronic. But something about that real stuff has and will always have a value that electronic information will never have. And so there was a lot of exploitation from the onset. And I guess I realized that there were some things that I didn't feel were supposed to be out there. And I felt that there were some things that, in some ways, you have to be sick or crazy to believe it's something that you need, but it's just part of what popular culture was doing, because people had never really had a chance to be with one another in that way. But the library network was a system where they could bring all of those systems together. Every system in every community is plugged in some way to the library. All of the organizations, most of the businesses that are lucrative and successful, they're going to be invested in that library, and they're going to put something in that library. And so they ended up doing something where they impeded the public's ability to help the library, communities, and information evolve. Because the same people who were the stakeholders, the monopolizers. They had control of the flow of the information. And so these independent systems, these privatized systems of institutions, organizations, and corporations became very powerful because they could regulate not only what they had, but who would have access to it. And so all I did was took the time out to document for people in an academic way what's going on so that they better understand what they're doing. Because if you choose as an adult to give your life away to a certain thing, at least you have some knowledge of it. But technology can move so fast that you can also give away somebody else's life before they have a chance or are old enough to understand that they didn't have to or want to do that. And we're supposed to protect the liberty of the people that haven't come here yet, the next generation. And that's why this information is so important. You can expect to be harassed a lot in some of these library systems. You can expect to be harassed a lot because these people make their living off of regulating that kind of information, even if it doesn't belong to them, even if they're taking advantage of somebody else to do it. And if they don't want somebody to have access to certain kinds of information, they have security mechanisms now where they can make trouble for you to put you in a position where you can't have access to the information. And so what I did was created my own information system. And then you network through other people so that even if they tried to stop you from getting access to certain kinds of information, then you can work with your network and find other ways to obtain that information. And not only that, you might find yourself in a position where the library actually needs you for information because you have something that they would not otherwise have access to that can make what they're doing more viable. I had a chance to see what the library system was and be a part of what the library system was before the technology. I had a chance to see how computers transitioned into the library from what it first began as databases, as a card catalog, as an electronic card catalog, and then making it evolve into these internet catalogs that could be shared across the world. The library system is an international network that's connected to libraries all over the world. Somebody as simple as a person that appears to be a harmless librarian can spread something that can ruin somebody's life all around the world at the push of a button. And so politicians, law enforcement officers, safety systems, or other people who have an interest in that type of thing in terms of reputation, character assassination, or whatever, started to collaborate with these libraries because they know that they can get a second or third party to call the problem for them. A lot of information that exposes truth can be living in institutional settings. A library holds truth and non-truth sometime. And you can actually find information sometime that gets somebody in trouble in a library. So it really depends on the quality of the people that are being allowed to practice in what is called the profession of information science. It's something that could easily be neglected or abused if people choose to. And when you come across those people who are serious, those librarians who really care about what that profession is about and what it's supposed to mean for students, for citizens, and for others, researchers or professionals, you have to do what you can to retain those kinds of people. Because it takes a certain kind of person to retain order of information when you're talking about massive amounts of information. And the nation itself is invested in one called the Library of Congress. And all library systems, in some kind of way, are also interchangeably plugged into the Library of Congress. So think about what that means. There can be a federal agenda to start a library witch hunt against a given person who hasn't really done anything at all, to keep them from either obtaining access to information or to try to find a way to take their information from them. Because the Library of Congress can accept things that ends up in what's called in the future a public domain. And sometimes they realize the public domain can catch up with them For example, there can be something that somebody did that they weren't supposed to do. And some third or fourth party subject has information about what they did wrong. And they did not release that information publicly. They decided to wait 50 years later and publish it. And once you publish it and get a copyright on it, it goes into the Library of Congress. And so now you have a living person who has something that they did wrong that's published now that can catch up with them and their family 50 years later. And the members of Congress know that. And so sometimes, just because you know too much, you can get targeted by your own government. Because everything about government is not clean. And so what I'm saying is we have to re-educate people about what information actually means. Because they screwed up our socialization, they screwed up our educational and academic development by making people believe that you don't have to work as hard and you can just go on the internet and look up something and take it. They didn't really discuss plagiarism. They didn't really discuss the theft of intellectual property. They didn't really discuss the violation of copyright or any of that stuff. Because most people are not really interested or have an understanding of what information really means. But the internet afforded new protections. And Congress did, in fact, do some things, some members of Congress, to put in protection mechanisms for that part of human liberty that nobody was aware of. I only try to connect and associate with the people and the things where I think there's some structure and there's some well-intention amongst somebody to maintain the kind of order that is necessary to protect public information. Because without public information, none of this stuff works. TV can't work, radio can't work, none of it. All those people have to go do research. And there is still so much material that's undiscovered or that's unpublicized. Like there are places that are housing lots and lots of information. See, a library can obtain information from people that they're not really supposed to have. A library can obtain information from people or store information from people that is stolen. You have to have somewhere to have it. There's a lot of unclaimed information, and they know that somebody's family in the future can come back and say, hey, he never or she never gave you permission to have that. How did you get it? And we want to pursue it because as a family, that's our property. And so how people obtained what they have is beginning to matter again, because a lot of the successful people stole a whole lot. And so if you're a person that's aware of how these kinds of systems work and the cultural value of what's stolen, you better believe they'll try to attack you because they knew they weren't supposed to do what they did in the first place. And I ended up in some kind of situation where they thought that they could put a certain class of people in a poverty system and they would remain in a poverty position permanently, in a low educated position, and continue to cycle. And I ended up beating the odds and doing something that one in millions of people do. And I didn't let them put me into a system of deprivation and limitation where I stopped myself from growing because they wouldn't let me in. I went and pioneered some things to make myself be included for my actual value rather than let somebody else do it for me. And that became the problem for them. And so they had set up some things to lead my life down a path that they tried to orchestrate. And the things that I actually did with my own life were in contradiction to what they tried to make happen. And now somebody stands to get in trouble for the mechanisms that they engaged in to try to basically ultimately steal from me. And I don't understand why they didn't just work with me, make sure I could get mine and share it in the first place. But they thought because of the history of African Americans in this country that they could just do what they did the first time when they first brought African Americans here. Just take it, just enslave you, just imprison you, just destroy you and control you. And I wouldn't let them. And so they just tried to create a public witch hunt. And so I went to task at trying to prepare the information that would give the public awareness of what actually happened versus what they claimed, and also give them awareness of what may have happened to them too. Which far as I've seen so far, nobody else has done, particularly in the age of technology. And so I started to try to collaborate more with the attorneys and with the legal process in the Department of Justice, with Congress, and even with the President of the United States to take on these very important issues of liberty. But I first started on my own, and nobody knew I had the ability to do so, nor did they think I could actually carry it out from the position that I was in, because I was basically, in some regards, forced into a position of destitution. And if you're destitute, you don't have the means to take care of what you need to do, and you don't have the means to protect your information, which is how everybody lost their information in the first place. And that's also a deprivation of liberty. And I simply caught them, and I did something about it. And then I started going to the people who had similar interest in protecting those basic liberties, because a lot of the people that had been tenured people did not really have a grip and grasp on what this technology could do and be, because they can only base what they legislate on how the citizens actually use that information and what they do with that information. And I happen to be on both sides of the equation from a position that nobody thought something like that could come from. And so they treated that as a new kind of threat. They started calling those kinds of people an existential threat, because you know the truth. There are a lot of imposters. There are a lot of people being taken advantage of. Is what it really boils down to. And if you're the one that knows where the theft, the greed, the illegal activity is or something, you can get targeted for that, because a lot of people have made their fortunes and built their fortunes off of deception. And it all begins with information. And somebody as simple as a little old lady in the library can cause a wave of something that can become something that reaches the level of crime and murder and be completely lying. If you come across great librarians and people in information science, you should value them. You should appreciate them. You should respect them, because those are the people that created the information pathway for you to be able to do whatever it is that you need to do to have awareness of what it takes for you to find your way through just about any situation that involves information. And a lot of people take that for granted. Most people take that for granted. A lot of people in the lower level libraries, the school libraries for elementary school and high school, a lot of people take libraries for granted. And to some degree, a lot of libraries at that level also were first to exploit the young people's lives by way of information. And so we have to get a system of checks and balances for our information here, because even high government is struggling with these very same issues. The CIA, the Secret Service, the FBI, the Department of Justice, Congress, the president, they all have libraries. There's always information somewhere. And a lot of information is exclusive to them until they get ready to make something public. Sometimes information is so classified or so important, so secret, it can't be public. And so having an understanding and a grip on information matters. Handling information is not something for just a general citizen. That kind of information is something that only professionals should be handling. And if a general citizen gets a hold of that kind of information, it can be a threat or liability. And that's why they started making laws to try to figure out what they could do to regulate people who breach certain bounds of information. And what you find out is that even some of the people from the inside are leaking classified information or hacking into classified information and creating public scandals that end up altering the course of everybody's lives in the country and around the world, as well as creating public political scandals at taxpayer expense. And that's what we just saw happen in the case of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and this battle between the Democrats and the Republican Party over who breached or leaked or did not properly secure electronic and other information as pertains to the security of the United States of America. I hope this has provided you some insight and some clarity on how this information system works. This is some information that's bigger than just reading from a teleprompter or preparing a script as a producer or going out into the field shooting video as a videographer. The management of that information is really important. The programming and the timing of the dissemination and distribution of that information is very important. The discretion of that information being disseminated or otherwise distributed is very important. And it does really take professionals to handle this material. It doesn't mean that a common person can't figure out how to disseminate or distribute the information. Anybody can distribute information now, but knowing how and when and what to protect, who is worthy, who is qualified to manage the information, and you better believe it can come from different places. A person with no background in politics and no formal education can be more gifted than people that went to school for 20, 30 years now. So it really comes down to not just skills based upon traditional academic background, which certainly matters. It comes down to who's actually qualified to know what they're doing and how to manage it. It takes a certain maturity. It takes a certain kind of professional demeanor. It takes a certain kind of discretion, and it takes a certain kind of awareness, because everything that you do with information, you have to have some awareness of what can come as a result of that. The unpredicted parts, the parts that are unforeseen, we kind of have to live with as a society. But you're trying to set the information on a path to end up in the best and most responsible place. But what happened was, over the course of a 15 or 20 year period, people were intentionally setting information on a path to injure people, to destroy their reputations, to publicly embarrass people, to blackmail people, to create public scandals and local scandals. And so if you want to know what's really going on, find out who documented the actual details and who documented the actual details fairly and accurately, because you can alter the course of history by providing misinformation, limited information, omitted information, twisted or distorted information, or by simply hiding the information and not making it publicly known, or expressing its whereabouts at the time when it's needed. You always see these secret files, these little known or unfound tapes, or this material that comes up later in life. In the year 2040, they are scheduled to release some of the records of the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King. So when you're looking at why they've been trying to work so hard to keep Martin Luther King relevant, they already have plotted in the year 2040 to bring forth another dimension of what went on in Martin Luther King's life. They wrote a book called Hellhound on His Trail. They stalked and followed that man every place he went, everything that he did, and made an archive of it throughout his life. And a lot of it was illegal. And so now they're going to come forward, because the system can only protect it for so long before it becomes what I described to you before, a public record. Once it becomes a public record, anybody that has awareness of it can go investigate it, and you might find out that there are still living people who participated in that, who can still end up being held accountable. So they often try to make sure the information isn't released until the people that were a part of it are no longer available to answer any questions about it. And that's where the fraud is. And so when you're talking about the people who are already set back and behind in terms of the information and the access, in the first place, obviously African Americans would be at the back of the line. And so when an African American like me emerges, who has provided information directly from the actual person, because obviously Martin Luther King can't speak on his own behalf because they assassinated him. But what he did when he was living speaks for who he was more than anything that any third or fourth party can come up with. Second, third, or fourth party can come up with to say otherwise. And so this stuff is very important now because society has lost track with what's real, and we're not really hearing from actual people anymore like you used to in the past. So somebody who has lived for 40 years might not be able to have the information that's actually from them available so that people can actually talk to the actual person, like during the time when Martin Luther King was alive. Because a lot of people have put all their information into the cyber portal. And so there are only a few people really who have invested in documenting in a way that has cultural value, something that can be utilized for generations to come that can't be ignored in the way that Martin Luther King did. No matter what people try to say about Martin Luther King, what he actually did and documented speaks more volume. They invested the whole country in stopping that man because they knew that there would be very few black men who could bring people together in general like that, particularly during a time when the objective was to try to figure out how to keep people divided and keep black people in particular from catching up. And so these burdens of that nature were placed on us by our elders. This isn't really something that my generation is responsible for, but our generation is responsible for accounting for itself. And unfortunately, very few of us have. And that's what made the musicians, the movie makers, the writers, and the authors end up so popular during my generation, because they were documenting something to account for our generation. But some of the stuff that they were documenting wasn't actually coming from actual people. They were making their own version of the information. And that was why I was met with so much opposition, because a lot of people stole their way in. It's the bottom line. And if they had simply been willing to share or make sure that people are compensated for what they bring to the table, it would have never become an issue, but they thought they were going to get away with it. And one of the ways they were getting away with it was incriminating people, imprisoning people, and murdering people, because people had no awareness of their cultural value. Like a person like Whitney Houston or somebody. You can murder somebody and make it look like they murdered themselves. Murder doesn't just start on a specific event. It's a bunch of things that led up to what became that situation. It can be a completely innocent person who hasn't done anything wrong to anybody, but they lived their life for 30 years vulnerable, not believing that there was any threat or danger in society. Well, something built up to the point where that vulnerability finally left them rendered into a position where somebody harmed them. So this information is serious. You know, something about this entitlement culture makes people believe they don't need to be concerned about any information unless they're getting something for it at somebody else's expense. And let's just say the system caught up with itself. And I was willing to, I guess, run in the back until it was time to make the move to see if you can make a run for the finish line at the end. You know, some of those great runners that we see in track were people that either hung towards the back of the line or in the center of the line to just stay with the crowd during the race. And then when the finish line was in sight, they knew when to kick in that last leg and make a competition of it and end up in front of everybody. Some people go out there and they sprint ahead so fast that they're out there running alone, and they get rewarded for that. But the things that we remember the most a lot of times have to do with the ones that had to actually compete for it, where they were actually running with other people who were equally talented, and they actually had to work for that win. Even if they blew them out, they still had to work for some of it. We have people now that are putting in mechanisms now so that people can sprint out ahead with no competition by stacking the race in such a way that they put people in the competition who really aren't supposed to be competing at that level, and then take the people out of the game who can actually compete at that level so that it doesn't look like that person isn't as good as they actually appear to be. And so it's tough. The information highway is a complicated one. I've tried to just give you an analogy of how complicated these things are. The internet is just like a bunch of lanes on a track. And it's reached a point where people are just trying to sprint to see who can get the information to the finish line first. And whoever gets the information to the finish line first is the one that gets the most out of it. And that often starts with something called breaking news. If you're the first person to get the interview, you're the first person to get the footage, you're the first person to get the information, that's what people want to know. That's how you can retain an audience. That's what you can develop a relationship for. And so I just kind of waited, and I didn't give anybody the part that can make them first yet, because I want to see who's going to be the first one to handle it the right way and get the kind of mileage out of it that's supposed to come of it when it's said and done. Because everybody's going to end up sharing it anyway at some point. But people like to be the first one to feel like they had the part in something that matters. And I understood that a long time ago. It's almost like who's the first person to get the best person in a relationship, right? You know, that matters. It doesn't matter what happens after that, but everybody's trying to see who can be the first one. And information and business can often be the same, but you'd be surprised what can happen with those people that were in that competition. They might not have been number one, but they were right there. They were right there in that race. And sometimes you find out the one that was at the back of the race who saw all of the other champions ends up being more powerful than all of them, because they know what it took for all of them to be in that race more than anybody. A lot of times the ones that are sprinting out ahead don't really know what it took and what sacrifices are made by the ones that didn't win the race. And we get caught up in this thing about believing that just because somebody didn't win the race, that they have no value. And now we're finding out everybody that was second or less ends up being more powerful sometimes, because they're the ones that actually had to compete. They really actually understand the field, and they learn more about how to win. When you're running as an individual, sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. But information is serious. And the information highway is often just like a track, just like lanes on a track. And just keep that in mind when you're looking at how the flow of information depends on who's popular versus who's not popular. Sometimes the things that you need to be looking for are not first. Sometimes it's the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, even. And so you have to figure out what's best. Everybody doesn't want to sprint to be first. Some people like to play at the back. Some people like to fish on the bottom, so to speak. Some people like to fish at the top. God bless you.